Welcome to one of the most listened to music news podcasts in the world, SGNP, with your host, Darren Sutherland. Join us as we talk with industry leaders, artists, and entertainers about their faith, family, and careers. This is information you will not find anywhere else on radio, web, or in a magazine, but only firsthand on SGNP.
Lamar Trammell Quartet.
Jesus told his faithful disciples, meet me over on the other side. I will meet you when the waters you have crossed. But in the midst of stormy sailing, what do we do? They fearful, they cried. Out of the darkness came his answer. Meet me over on the other side. Do not fear the raging water. Trust in me and face the storm. I will calm the winds around you. In my hand you're safe from harm. The waves he's rolling and the wind stop blowing. That's my time in the midst of the tide. Be not afraid of the tossing billows. Lead me over on the other side. God's still speaking to his children. Lead me over on the other side. Though the storms of life are many, will reach our goal. He is watching for the storm clouds. He will be our Savior and guide. Can't you hear him gently beckon? Meet me over on the other side. Do not fear the raging water. Trust in me and face the storm. I will calm the winds around you. In my hand you're safe from harm. The waves cease rolling and the wind stop blowing. That's my child in the midst of the tide. Be not afraid of the tossing billows. Meet me over on the other side. Well, do not fear the raging water. Trust in me and face the storm. I will calm the winds around you. In my hand you're safe from harm. Well, the waves cease rolling and the wind stop blowing. That's my child in the midst of the tide.
Be not afraid of the tossing billows.
Meet me over on the other
And welcome back once again to SGNP Season 3. Darren Sutherland, my co-host, Arthur Rice. Arthur, how you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing good.
You know, it seems like we missed the last 2 weeks and have been running the best of. And last week, we run the best of with Jason Clark and, you know, of the Nealons. And, boy, we got a ton of downloads. People really like Jason. I didn't realize he was that popular. Them hats he wore was that popular. You think it's Jason that's popular or people wanting to hear about Kelly? What do you think?
Well, it could be a little of both.
That's it. I give him a hard time about those hats every time I see him. But Jason's our good friend, and he's overcome some things. And, boy, they bought that farm this year, and what a year to buy a farm. Wouldn't you agree? 2020. Man alive.
Oh, perfect. God's timing.
That's it. Well, you know, Arthur, today's going to be a fun day because very seldom do we get to talk to a living legend that's in their prime. And what I mean in their prime is, you know, usually, let's just face it, when we talk to a living legend, they're 80 years old. They're old up there. But Mark Trammell is our guest today, is one of your contemporaries. And George and Glenn called him the best quartet man in the history of the business. He sang with who all was he sang with? The Senators, the Kingsmen, who all? I mean, I don't know before the Kingsmen who he said.
Gold City, and then
Gold City, Greater Vision, the Cathedrals.
Yeah.
Who hadn't he sang with? That'd be more like the question, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah, who's who.
And then he's got his own group now, and doing a great job with that. And we're gonna have Mark on, and just talk about his group, his career, and life in general. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
And you
Yeah,
know,
it'll be fun.
and you know when Mark's around, he's going to talk a little bit about the Lord because he's a preacher, of course. And you know, if you get a preacher talking, what happens, Arthur?
A preacher and a singer, like Squire says, you can't sing for preaching, can't preach for singing.
That's it. That's it. But we'll be right back in just a second with Mark Trammell. But first, check us out on Facebook. That's right. Check us out on Facebook, SouthernGospelNewsPodcast.com. You can check us out on Instagram, Twitter, all those fun places you can check us out. Have you seen the new social media app yet, Arthur? Parler? That's what it's called, Parler. Have you even heard of it? That's the next thing.
No, Lord, I hadn't heard of it.
Yeah, it's supposed to come out and compete with TikTok. So, they said the Chinese got us on this TikTok thing, so they want everybody to go to Parler. So, who knows? We're going to have more social media engagements, and we have time to post on them before long, are we not?
You know me, I'm right on top of all that social media stuff.
Well, we'll have some good times and some fun times. Right back here in just a second on Southern Gospel News Podcast with our special guest, Mark Trammell.
Hey, folks, you're listening to Southern Gospel News Podcast. That's right, SGNP. My buddy Darren Sutherland and Arthur Rice, they are knocking it out of the park. Listen, check them out. Continue to listen, but be sure to check out Southern Gospel Point of View on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.
Hey, this is Darren, and I'm here for my buddy Mike Lindell and My Pillow. That's right, My Pillow. I got to tell you a little secret, and this is a true story. The other day I'm laying in the bed, I looked at Mary and I said, I'm going to get me some new pillows today. She said, what do you need with new pillows? You got them. I said, I got one that's decent. And I didn't know which one it was. I mean, I knew which one it was, and I pulled the cover off of it, and it was my pillow. The rest of them were these ones that we bought from TJ Maxx or Target or Walmart or somewhere that just had worn out their welcome. And you know what, guys? I feel like I needed new pillows. And she said, well, why don't you call My Pillow, because you like the one you got there, and tell them what you're looking for, and they'll help you out. You know what I called, and guess what? They helped me out. They asked me what size I was. They asked me how I slept. Did I sleep on my back or on my side or on my stomach? What felt right? Feathers or, blah, 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 foam. They asked me all these questions. More questions than I ever dreamed about a pillow, and I got my new My Pillow in the mail, and I've slept right. You want that change in your life? It's real simple. 1-800-338-2330. 1-800-338-2330. Use the code word SGNP. That's right, the code word SGNP. And tell them you heard about this special offer. And when you use that code, you'll get a great discount from the folks at My Pillow. I use My Pillow. You should too. 1-800-338-2330. Use the code SGNP. My Pillow, the official pillow and sleep provider of Southern Gospel News Podcast. And welcome back to Southern Gospel News Podcast. Darren Sutherland, your host. My co-host up there in Sevierville, Tennessee, is the one and only Arthur Rice, president of Southern Gospel Music Association and lead singer with the Kingdom Heirs. And Arthur, this is one of your best buddies today, so I'm going to let you bring him on and introduce him. And he's a living legend, folks. Let's just be frank with you. But Arthur, you take
legend in my own mind. That's right.
Glad to have my pal, Mark Trammell. Welcome, buddy. Welcome.
Thank you, Arthur.
Mark,
good to be a part of the podcast today.
Man, Mark, it's so good to have you. We've I think you're going to, I'm 51 years old, and the first time I saw you, you were with the Cathedrals. Next thing I know, you were with Greater Vision. Next thing I know, you're over with Gold City. Next thing I know, you just moving and doing your own thing, and the Lord's blessed you a little bit, wouldn't you say?
He truly has. 46 years I've been doing this now. And those groups you talked about, have been a part of the fabric of what the Lord has allowed me to do, and they've helped to make me whatever it is that I am today. I thank God and those folks that allowed me to be a part of carrying this great message of gospel through song. And Arthur knows how I feel as much as anybody does. Arthur and I are brothers in the Kingsman world. Once a Kingsman, always a Kingsman.
Yeah.
And we truly have embraced that. And I love that about him, the dedication that it takes to be a part of the Kingsman organization. It is a brotherhood, and once you're there, you always have brothers. You always have people around you that can help you out of a dark spot, and I love that about the people in our industry, but especially about that organization that we share. It's been a good part of our lives.
Yeah. It's very unique, isn't it? It really is. I mean,
it is, for a fact.
You're part of different groups all through your career and things, but boy, there is just something unique about being in that Kingsman organization. You really are truly brothers. You really are.
Yes, that's right.
It's really neat. Hey, Mark, while we're on that subject, tell the folks, you were kind of like me. You're starting out young. You were just glad to have a job. But,
yes, sir.
When you
That's the truth.
And when you left the Kingsman and went with the cathedrals, back then the cathedrals weren't, they weren't what we know them today. But
right.
You left the Kingsman and went with the cathedrals. What was your mindset there, and your kind of your process of getting into that in with those guys?
Well, the big thing is quartet people will understand this brief story. In those days, back in the 70s, especially 60s and 70s, it wasn't common then for you to leave one group to go with another and have the blessing of the former manager. But Eldridge Fox, I spent all day long when I found out that opening was there, and my love for the cathedrals goes back to when I was a kid and I watched them on the Cathedral of Tomorrow when they were still a part of the Rex Humbard television program every Sunday morning. We'd watch it on television at home in Little Rock where I grew up. And I fell in love with them, and I fell in love with their music. And it's so funny because I spent all day the day after I found out that opening was there trying to figure out how to tell Foxy that I wanted to go try out for the cathedrals. And it being something that's funny to us now, I did not have a clue that back in those days, if you told the manager that you wanted to go somewhere else, usually that was your last day with that group.
Yeah.
That's just the way it was in most cases. And Foxy, God love him, I spent most of the morning that morning at the office there in Asheville. And it got close to lunchtime, and I had run errands for Jerry, who was the secretary for Kingsman at the time, and had done a few things around the office. I had taken my wife to work early that morning there at the mall in Asheville, and she worked at the Clinique cosmetic counter back in those days as a manager. And so I'd taken her to work, and I went there, and I spent the morning there and just kind of hanging around. And just before lunch that particular day, Foxy said, "Marky, come in here a minute." So I walked into the office and sat down. He said, "Tell me what's going on." I said, "Well, nothing in particular." He said, "Oh, something's going on because none of my guys have historically just come to the office and hung around on Monday morning. They've usually got stuff they need to do. So tell me what's happening." And in a very broken voice, I began to try to explain to him, there's an opportunity for me to try out for the Cathedral Quartet, and I love them as much as I love the Kingsmen. And he looked at me and smiled. He said, "This is a first." He said, "How soon can you try out?" I said, "Well, I think I could try out next week if things go well." the cathedrals were at the Singing in the Smokies that night. And I told him, I said, I'm planning to leave here and go to Bryson City for the evening and talk to Glenn and George about this possibility. But I said, I just somehow I felt like I need to get your blessing before I did that. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, you find out if they'll let you come try out, and if they will, I'll fly you to Akron, Ohio next week. And he said, here's the way it's going to work. He said, you go up there and try out if they let you. And if they tell you that you can have the job if you want it, then you take it if that's what you want to do, and you have my blessing. He said, if something happens and you don't think it's right, you come back home and don't ever breathe a word of this to anybody. Nobody will know it but me and you. And, of course, Big Jim's in heaven today, so I can say this, and we can all laugh about it. I didn't figure out till later that what he was doing was protecting me from Big Jim fussing at me for wanting to be somewhere else. But that's the way it happened. That truly is, that's not a story we made up. That truly is the way it went down that day. And I went that evening to the Singing in the Smokies, and when I got there, my wife and I got out of the car, I walked up by their bus on the way into the gate there at the Singing in the Smokies, and George had just gotten off the bus. He turned around and looked at me and said, what are you doing here? Aren't you off today? I said, yes, sir, we are. I said, but I just came over to see you all and talk to you, to be honest with you, because I heard that this baritone position's coming open, and Steve Lee's been here for 6 months, and he's decided to go home. The road's not for him. He said, well, that's right. He said, have you talked to the old man yet? I said, no, sir, I hadn't. This is as far as I've gotten. He said, well, you go talk to the old man about it. He said, I think we'd just love to have you. He said, and then he asked me, he said, have you talked to Mr. Fox about this yet? I said, it's funny. I talked to him this morning about it. He said, but what did he say? I said, well, he gave me his blessing and told me that he'd fly me to Akron next week if y'all would let me try out. He said, you need to go talk to Glenn. So I did. And long story short, after my brief conversation with Glenn, he said, we'll see you next Tuesday. And Arthur, I was scared out of my mind. I knew that I was no more ready for a position like that, and I could fly upside down. But somehow the good Lord wouldn't leave me alone about it. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. My wife said, this is just really strange of you to not be able to sleep nor eat, because at that point she'd never known of me to not be able to do both and just go right on with life. But I did. I did fly up there to Akron, Ohio, and tried out that day. And the next morning, I flew back home, a member of the Cathedral Quartet. Wow! And when I got home, I called Mr. Fox and told him, and I said, "But I want to know how long you notice that you want me to work. I know that things don't just jump up in our face. We don't change things overnight." He said, Marky, give me 2 weeks. He said, I need to get Wayne Maynard situated where he can hit the road with us full time. And Wayne had been traveling with us some at that point. And he said, if I can get him situated in 2 weeks, you'll be free to go. So July 21st, 1980 was my first weekend out with the Cathedrals. And I was there for almost 11 years. And enjoyed every day of it. My wife and I bought a home 3 doors up from George Johnson. I thought I lived in heaven all of those years.
That's a great, I've never heard that story. That's an awesome story.
Really? That's exactly the way it happened.
That's a great, I can believe it. Eldridge was he was one of a kind. He really was.
Prince. He was a prince of a guy.
No doubt.
Yep.
He truly was.
Well, Mark, you've told us about how you left the Kingsmen, and nobody's never heard that story. Tell us about 11 years later. Let's just keep going down memory lane and talk about what happened leaving the Cathedrals and joining Greater Vision, and how that transpired.
11 years later, I found myself realizing that I was miserable, didn't know why. I was with at that point the number one group in the nation. The cathedrals had risen to that spot by then, and I'm wondering why on earth, Lord, would you? I finally figured it out that the Holy Spirit was talking to me about my time there being over with. And Gerald had been to the cathedrals and had left and gone back home and had been a soloist for a year. And just a few months prior to my leaving, we were at the National Quartet Convention in the fall of 1990. And Gerald came by the booth to see all of us. And he asked me how I was doing. I said, I'm doing good. I said, how's the solo thing going? He said, well, we've got Larnell Harris and we've got Sandy Patty. And he said, we don't need another Larnell Harris. And that's what the record company seems like they want to try to make out of me. He said, I'm not Larnell. I'm just Gerald. And he said, it's lonely. When Donna don't go with me, it's lonely out here. I said, well, it's about time for you to start a trio, isn't it? And he said, yeah, and laughed. He said, yeah, actually it is. So after the convention was over, the following week, I called him. I said, are you ready? He said, for what? I said, to start that trio. And he laughed. He said, if you're telling me that you think you're the one that's going to help me start the trio, you've lost your mind. I said, why is that? He said, well, because right now is not a good time to start anything new. I said, well, that's what the world says, but this won't leave me alone. He said, well, when do you want to start? I said, well, Christmas time would be a good time to start, I think. He said, you really do think that we need to do this? I said, well, you pray about it and you tell me. Well, 2 days later, he calls me back and says, you talked to George and Glenn about this? I said, well, we're getting ready to leave on my what was my last trip to the West Coast with the cathedral. I said, I'm going to sit down and write a letter to George and Glenn, explain to them what's going on and the fact that I'm not upset. I'm not tired of being with them. I'm not tired of being a cathedral. But I do know that the Lord has once again tapped me on the shoulder and said, I've got more for you to do. And I did write that letter. And I found out all of these years later, I found out last year at Van Payne's homegoing service that Todd, their son, Glenn and Van's son, still has that letter that I wrote to Glenn. And Todd said, you don't know this, but Glenn kept that letter. He said he never got a resignation letter like that. And he said he kept it in his safe all of those years till he went to glory. And my letter was simple, a simple explanation, the reality that I was not uncomfortable nor displeased with what was going on, what the good Lord was accomplishing through us, but I knew that I was supposed to be doing this, and that was to start a new group, a new ministry with Gerald Wolfe and whoever the Lord put in our path. And that literally is how it happened, and I gave that letter to them on that October trip, and I gave them 2 months to find somebody else. And in December, I left there with their blessing, and Gerald and I started that trio, and George and Glenn helped us to get dates, to confirm a record contract with the Benson Company. And boy, all those things just fell in place. My wife and I moved, and my son and I moved to Morristown, Tennessee, and we spent 3 years there before this door opened for us to move further south. My wife's folks were getting up in years, and she was driving 7-8 hours back and forth each way to help tend to their needs, and it was becoming very taxing on her. And I thought, Lord, hey, for something else I can do somewhere else where she can get closer to her folks, and it be less of a labor on her and a strain on us, I'm willing to do it. And I'm telling you, within days, I found out about the Gold City opening, and I talked to Tim Riley, and he says very similar things that I had already heard. I don't know why you want to come here, But, boy, I sure would love to have you help me rebuild Gold City. And the door opened, and we went through that door, and I spent almost 9 years with Gold City. Every day of the Greater Vision years, every day of the Gold City years, I spent just every once in a while, I still had to pinch myself because God's allowed me to do what my first love is and has always been. And I was still involved in this music, and I'd gone back to the quartet world, and I've been able to sing with some of the best bass singers that God has ever allowed to breathe. And I'm just very blessed in that. And now you look at it, and 18 years later, here we are with this group that we've had now, and God continues to bless. Even in the midst of COVID-19, God continues to supply our needs and keep us out here in front of these people that love this music and desperately need to hear the message in it.
Mark, you know, anytime we bring an artist on and we hear these stories, Arthur can tell you this, it's almost like a metaphor that the Lord brings us when we're doing these shows that's going to reach out to all the thousands of listeners that listen. When I sit and I hear your story, you wasn't a young man. You wasn't a new guy in this industry. You were a veteran who was leaving one major group to go to another. We've got a lot of people in this world right now who's working their jobs, and something's going to close down or something's going to change, and they're going to have to move. And they're going to have to move in their 30s, their 40s, and their 50s. And you've done this in an industry that it's really unheard of at your age and those points to do that. What advice would you have for these people? Because, we're living in crazy, perilous times right now, okay?
Yes, sir.
You changed when when the common sense person would say, dude, you're with the cathedrals. Why would you leave? You've just started with Greater Vision. I saw you guys. You may or may not remember this. When you guys first started out, it was either January, February, or March. I can't remember. It was cold. But you came to our home church, Central Baptist Church, where Tony Peace was the music director at the time, and you guys sang with the Hoppers, and it was one of your first concerts. And I never will forget. I said, man, these guys have got something. These guys got something. Then all of a sudden, you get changed again, but this time you're following probably another one of the greatest groups ever in Gold City and bringing in a new brand to Gold City. And each time you added something special. You follow what I'm saying? Have you ever looked at it like that man, there's men and women out there in this crazy world. What do they need to do? Because somebody's in a transition period right now, and they need to hear these stories you're telling. I believe that, Arthur. I just do.
Yep, I do too.
I'll tell you, I've had some wise old preachers down through the years, various times, to feed into me and to remind me that this is not about me. This is about the work of the Lord. And obedience. More than anything else, it's obedience. If you obey what God tells you to do, as my dad used to say, where God guides, he provides. My family and I have been able to eat all of these years, and I'm convinced now, as one of the older guys in the industry, which is odd to say, but I'm convinced now, looking back on all of these years, 46 years, the number one key to the success of my family having their needs provided has been just sheer obedience to the voice of the Holy Spirit of God. And it don't have to make sense to the world to make sense to God. In fact, usually it don't make sense to the world.
Yeah.
But if you just do what God tells you to do next, when he tells you to do it, he always provides whatever your needs are and will take care of you and your family. It don't matter what it is. It don't matter where it is. The last place I ever dreamed at age 20 when I went to the cathedrals, the last place I ever dreamed I'd wind up living is in Gadsden, Alabama, all of these years later. Having the ability now for the last 18 years, having the ability to live anywhere in the world I wanted to live, but right here became home. We've been in this town for 23 years now. Doesn't seem possible, but that's just the way God is. And one preacher who Arthur would know very well, who was very instrumental in my life in the earlier days, was Ralph Sexton Sr.
Mm-hmm.
And we affectionately called him Poppy. And I remember vividly one Wednesday evening after church. In fact, the bus was leaving that night at 11 o'clock. We was going, I think, to Oklahoma City. And before we left that evening, my wife and I went to church, and I was struggling with this issue of going to the cathedral or trying out with the cathedral. So Poppy and Foxy were the only ones that knew anything about it. And I told Poppy first. He's my pastor at that time. And I told him, I said, I've heard your message, bloom where you're planted. And I said, I don't want to forsake what God's telling me to do and when he tells me to do it. And I want to be able to grow in the Lord and to be used in spite of myself most of the time. But I want to be used of God to encourage people, to take this music, what I know of it, and the way that I'm able to present the music, my part of what goes on in this music. I want to be able to do that as unto the Lord and give him the credit for it. And Poppy said, Marky, let me tell you something, son. You're going to find this out the older you get. But my message, bloom where you planted, you can't grow anything out of dry ground. And if the ground is dry, then you need to be uprooted and placed where there's soil, where you can grow, where there's moisture, where you can bloom. He said, don't ever mistake that. Don't ever misconstrue what I said in that message. He said, you've got to have fertile soil in order for something to grow. And he said, if it means you have to change fields to do it, then change them. And that stuck with me all of these years. I'm one of the few guys that has done what I've done as far as moving from one group to the other. But looking back on it now, every step
wow,
was nothing more than a step in the growth process of where God wanted me to be at this point. So I can't even brag about being with the Cathedrals. I can't brag about being with the Kings or even the Senators when I started at age 15. I can't brag about any of that. All the accolades and all the wonderful things that have happened. And now, as Arthur very well knows, it was an absolute shock when he called me one evening and my family sitting around me and said, Mark, you're not going to believe this, but maybe you should. You have been elected to be one of this year's members in this year's class of the Hall of Fame inductions, and you've been inducted.
Wow.
And I did not know what to say. I literally was dumbfounded. But all of these things, I just lay at the feet of the Lord. And I thank him for not giving up on me. I thank him for continuing to leave that hound of heaven at my heels every day until I said, okay, Lord, whatever it is, I want to do that next. And I'm going to be honest with you. I've never said this out loud to anybody. But if the Lord told me tomorrow, Mark, this part of the story is now over. We're going to move to the next chapter. And it's not going to be what you're doing now. I would have to face that, and I would have to go into whatever that is. Now, I have total peace in what I'm doing today. I have total peace in looking forward for many years in the group that I have and what we're doing. But if the Lord said to anybody, it doesn't matter that you've spent 25 years in this spot. It doesn't matter that you've spent 46 years with Goodyear or whoever it might be. What matters is if you're obedient to the voice of God, you don't have to worry about being able to eat and provide for your family next week. He will handle it.
Wow. That's good right there, Mark. That's good.
Arthur, we said wow at the same time. It's
That's great, buddy. That's good.
I thank the good Lord for it.
Mark, growing up in Little Rock,
truly
Arkansas, who did you want to be like, singing wise?
Oh my! It may be strange to you. Some of my favorite singers were Glenn Allred,
yeah,
baritone for the Florida Boys.
Yeah.
Doy Ott was one of my heroes with the Statesman. All of my heroes were gospel music singers back in those days, instead of sports, major sports celebrities, baseball players, or whatever you want to talk about. Gospel music and singers, quartets. I grew up. My dad was a Baptist minister. We grew up watching Singing Time in Dixie, Gospel Singing Jubilee, and the Cathedral of Tomorrow, Rex Humbard's television program. We watched those things, and most of the time we could get through 2 out of the 3, and most every Sunday I could at least hear 1 or 2 songs from the Cathedral Quartet before Rex would come to preach, because we'd have to leave to go to church.
Mm-hmm.
And so unless there was something special going on, we literally could see and hear all of that. Well, I grew up with all of that, and I grew up hearing all of that.
Yeah.
And I still, to this day, I can remember waking up on Sunday morning and my mama getting me ready. I was the youngest of 4 boys, and she would get me ready before she would get the older boys ready. And she knew that if she got me ready and set me down in front of that TV, I wouldn't move until it was time to go to church.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how much I loved it, even as a little boy. If you want to go further back than that, Joe Mann was the chairman of deacons in my dad's church, where my dad pastored, Barnett Memorial Baptist Church in Little Rock. And Joe Mann saw a little guy in the first grade coming in with his pastor, who was my dad, and on Sunday nights for just a brief visit, little social time. And Dad and Joe would talk about issues with the church, and Miss Agnes and my mom would sit around the table and drink coffee and eat pecan pie. And they figured out real quick, like, that if they wanted that fidgety little 6-year-old boy to be still, Joe said, "Do you like quartet music?" And my eyes got big as saucers. And my dad looked at it and said, "He loves quartet music." Joe said, "Well, I've got Statesman and Blackwood Brothers in there on the long play. If you want to go listen to that, you can listen to that while we're sitting here talking."
Wow.
And they would put those records on, and it happened, I don't know, probably 25 or 30 times during the years that Joe was an active part of our church before he went to heaven. So I give Joe Mann credit for helping what happened on Sunday mornings to develop my love for this music. They put them records on, and I've got those records now. And, of course, they're collector's items today. Mm-hmm. But I have worked through getting those Statesman and Blackwood records that I listened to at Joe Mann's house on Sunday night after church. And it takes me back to, this was the beginning days. This is orchestrated by God and God alone. They didn't know that they were investing in my future, and they were investing in what would be my first love, and that is this music, and it still is to right now.
Can you ever think of what you would have been had you not been a pastor and a preacher and a gospel music singer, Mark? Have you ever thought, I'd have been a roofer, I'd been a policeman, I'd been a doctor, I'd have been a lawyer? Have you ever thought what you would have done with your life had it not been for gospel music?
The only things that have really intrigued me outside of ministry, it's so funny you say that. My dad was bivocational when I was a little boy.
Yeah.
And he owned a plumbing and heating business, and he pastored a church. And that's what he did all my years growing up as a kid. And so I can tell you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the last thing I would have been was a plumber. Because I learned the hard way how to handle the right end of a pick and a shovel. And I learned as a young teen boy that these ditch digging machines that they have now, when they first came out, and I was a young teenager, when they first came out, I can remember it like I'm looking at my dad, and it was yesterday, telling my dad, he mentioned, son, I'm going to need you, it's Saturday's coming up, I'm going to need you to work Saturday, because we need to dig a water service for this new construction here in town that I'm working on. And I asked him, I said, Dad, can we go rent one of those ditch witch things? He said, you are my ditch witch. What are you talking about? You're going to dig the ditch. So, boy, the last thing I wanted to be, I knew God was going to call me to do anything but that. Because I despised having to get out there and get nasty, dirty. Now, you know, I'm in my 60s now, so I appreciate my dad teaching me what real work was.
Yeah.
And as a lot of people think that what we do is not real work. As Glenn Payne used to say, he'd tell the story about his dad. Somebody see Elmer in the grocery store, and they'd ask about Glenn. Hey, Elmer, that oldest boy of yours, Glenn, is he still singing, or did he get him a real job? Well, that's what a lot of people think about what we do. But as Arthur can vouch for me,
oh yeah,
if you do this the right way, there's a whole lot of work in it.
It's a whole lot of work.
Mark, we had a
Yes.
we had a comment on social media one time. But remember when you first came on as my co-host, Arthur, and they said, "Well, I know why he's got time to do that podcast, because every time I go to Dollywood, they're never singing anyway. They're always off." Remember that, Arthur?
Yeah.
We laughed about that.
They don't see all them days where they are there.
That's right.
3-6 times a day, whatever it would be during the season.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have been a plumber. You wouldn't have been a heating and air guy. What would you have been, Mark?
The other thing that intrigued me was being a chiropractor. So I probably would have been a chiropractor.
Wow.
There you
Wow.
go.
I never thought that.
Man. You talked about Ralph Sexton having an impact in your life. You talked about Joe Mann having an impact in your life. You've talked about Glenn and George. You've talked about Foxy. You've talked about Tim Riley. Who's somebody nobody hears about? If you call their name, the average gospel music fan's not going to know them. They're not going to know anything about them. But who's somebody that when Mark had to ask a question, it was an impactful person that you ask?
The very first name that comes to my mind, the gospel music world would know little to nothing about him. His name is Tom Elliott. And Brother Tom was the guy that led me to the Lord on the golf course, July 13th, 1988.
Wow.
And a lot of people say, wait a minute, you've done all this for all these years. How did you do this as a lost man? And I tell every one of them the very same story. I literally had a head knowledge of the Lord all of those years. I grew up in church. I knew how to put on a dark blue suit and a red tie and a Schofield Bible under my arm and go off to church and look just like everybody else that was doing it.
And you probably knew the Robert's Rules of Order at the same time, did you not?
What's that?
I said you probably knew the Robert's Rules of Order at the same time for Wednesday night when conference started. Yeah.
Yes, sir. All of those things that you grow up, and it's just it infiltrates your life. So you know how to do all the things and play the game. Mm-hmm. You know, you can walk the aisle, fill out the card, join the church, and you can teach other people how to do that. I've been on my knees with my Bible in my hand, leading people to the Lord in years prior to my actual salvation experience. And the day that happened, I was on the golf course after, again, God just making me so miserable that I didn't know my name. And for months, I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I find myself wondering what's happening here. And I told my wife about it the weekend before, or the week before we were to go to the Starlight Crusade in Oklahoma City. That was July of 1988. And I told her, I said, I don't know what's going on, but I've just been uneasy for months now. And when we got out there, Brother Tom preached a message on Sunday night, and the title of the message was Build an Ark and Save Your Home. And he began to walk through the process before you can do anything for this world, for this the community that you live in. You got to do something for yourself, and that is settle the question of your salvation. You can know all about the Lord, you can know all about the Bible, and you can still die and go to hell. Oh man, that hit me like somebody hit me with a ball bat. Mm-hmm. And so I wrestled with that night. We went back to the hotel. Fred Privet, our driver at the time for the cathedrals, he and I were sharing a room. We went to bed that night, and in order to not disturb him in his bed across the room, I snuck out of mine and got on my knees that morning about 6 o'clock. I couldn't sleep. And I got on my knees that morning about 6 o'clock, and I said, Lord, if you're trying to tell me I'm lost, I'm playing golf with some of these guys from the church in just a little while. There's a little golf outing they put together, 16 men from the church and the quartet. And it was literally a fleece. Asking God, show me. If this is what you're trying to tell me, show me so I can see it. I don't want to be ignorant of this. If this is what it is, I'm willing to do something about it. And men, as real as I'm talking to you right now, when we got to the golf course that morning, the guy that was putting groups together was standing out on the sidewalk at the Willow Creek Golf Club, right at the clubhouse. He's standing out on the sidewalk putting these groups together. And I'm just standing out there. Nobody has said anything to me. I'm standing. We've all the groups got all of our clubs off the bus, and we're just waiting for this guy to organize these groups. And he turns around, and Tom Elliff is walking up the sidewalk toward the clubhouse with his clubs over his shoulder. And this guy says, Brother Tom, we're glad you made it. He said, Mark Trammell's right behind me over here. He said, you and Jim Lee and Joe Cox are going to lead us off. You'll be the first group off of T1. And as soon as that man said that, it's like I froze in place. I couldn't move. And I thought, Lord, you're telling me I'm lost. I know about you, but I don't know the Lord Jesus as my Savior. I've got a head knowledge, but I don't have him living in my heart. And man, the first two holes, I couldn't tell you what took place. I could have had a hole in one. And unless somebody recorded it somewhere, I'd have never known it. But on the third tee box, we got out of the golf cart at the third tee box, and I looked at Brother Tom. I said, Brother Tom, you know a lot about my family, because he was from Arkansas too. And I said, you know a lot about my family, my dad pastoring, you know my family's history, something you don't know. He said, what's that, Mark? I said, I'm lost. He said, you're what? I said, I'm lost. I know about Jesus, a lot about him. I know a lot about the Bible, but I don't know Jesus as my Savior. As a teenager, I had walked the aisle. I had prayed a prayer with my lips that I didn't mean one word of with my heart. He said, well, right here is as good a place as any to settle that. I don't want us to move until you know. So we got on our knees right there. It was an old wooden bench right there at the third tee box of the Willow Creek Golf Course. And it was July in Oklahoma City, so the ground is cracked. It's so dry out there. But they had been watering that morning, so it's kind of muddy right where we are. And we get on our knees. I ain't paying no attention to the fact that it's muddy. I couldn't write my name down at that point. All I knew is I had to be saved right then. I had to know that the Lord Jesus had been invited into my heart. And I opened my heart, and I asked the Lord to save me. And Brother Tom prayed over me. He got up, and when he stood up, he just began to shout. And I look down. As I get up, I'm just squalling like a newborn baby. And I look down, and don't fuss at me. My independent Baptist brothers might fuss at me, but I had on shorts. It was so hot. We was playing in golf outfits that we could wear shorts with. I looked down, my bare knees had mud all over them. And I just looked at Brother Tom. He kind of smiled, and he said, "We got dirty, didn't we?" I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "It's odd. I'm dirty on the outside, but for the first time in my life, I feel clean on the inside."
Wow.
And by that time, Glenn and Danny Funderburk were in the foursome right behind us. And by that time, they'd gotten over there to where we were. And Brother Tom turned around and saw Glenn, and Glenn said, "What's going on? Something wrong?" And Glenn thought I was sick. He thought the heat had got me. And Brother Tom said, "No, man, it's heaven around here." He said, "I just led Brother Mark to the Lord." And Glenn come and hugged me, picked me up off the ground. He hugged me so hard. And he said, "Son, of all the boys that's ever traveled with me, I'd have never thought you'd lost." And it hit me when he said it. There's so many of us that can live the life, but you don't know how miserable a man is until you find a man that's trying to live saved and he's not.
No doubt.
That is a miserable, miserable feeling, because you have no power within you to continue to live that abandoned life. All you're doing is trying to live for people instead of live for the Lord. And Brother Tom taught me that day. The big difference is you don't have to please men another day. You please the Lord and follow him. And my goodness, what a valuable lesson I learned that day.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Arthur, I love these stories.
I do too. That's great, Mark. Wow.
I thank God for it. I truly do. So I guess that's why I can sit around on days like this on my front porch and just be happy that the Lord is still on his throne, and COVID-19 or whatever you want to throw at the child of God.
Wow.
If they're following the Lord, and another one of those messages pops in my head. You know the story of Abraham and Isaac, and the reality that Abraham had to go exactly to the place that God told him to go to in order for the substitutionary sacrifice to be in place, so that he wouldn't have to take the life of Isaac, his son.
Wow.
And I relive that as far as obedience. I relive that every time something like this comes up in my life. I automatically relive that story, and the fact that it don't matter where it is in the desert of life, you have to go to the place, the very place that God tells you to go, whether it makes sense to the world or not. You have to go to that place in order for God to fulfill what he told you he would do, which is, if you go where I tell you to go, you're not obligated to provide the need that you have in order to do what I tell you to do. I am. So if you go where I tell you to go, I'm obligated to fulfill everything that has to take place for you to do what I've called you to. If you don't go where the Lord tells you to go, God's not obligated to provide your needs. But he's obligated himself to do so if you're obedient and try to follow him. Don't make us perfect. Just makes us obedient. And I'd rather be obedient than anything I can think of, because I've seen what God will do when we are.
Wow. You answered my question I was about to ask you, and that was, you said you're one of the older guys now. What advice would you have to give to these younger guys now that are facing this COVID-19 situation that no artist has ever had to face in your history in gospel music? But no doubt you just answered it before we asked the question. It's all about obedience. And
literally.
Yeah.
Well, my family and I have sat here and watched God provide for 6 months. We've worked 11 dates as of right now. We've worked 11 dates since March 14th.
Yeah.
And I don't have to tell any of you that don't make it happen. But God has sent people, his people, the message of need in our lives, and they have provided our need. Literally, some weeks I sit here and I laugh and I squall and I laugh and I squall, and again, I sound like a broken record, but it don't make sense how God has done it if you're just sitting here looking at it from a worldly standpoint. Yeah. But when you look at it from the standpoint of, I get up every morning and I report to work. And as one of my old military friends says, you get up every morning, you report for duty. And that's in the army of the Lord, that's what we're to do. So that's what I do every day. I get up and I report to duty. And whatever God has for us today, that's what I want to try to do. I get in my own way so many times. But the willing heart to do what God has said next, he knows what he's doing with us. He made us. He knows we're frail. He knows we're weak. He knows we are come from out of sin. But the spirit man inside of us is the one that drives us. And if you are saved, buddy, I can tell you the difference between knowing about him and knowing him. And if you are saved, that hound of heaven, the Holy Spirit, will not leave you alone if you step out of the will of God. But being obedient, you can follow him every step of the way. Doesn't matter what happens in our lives. Don't matter. I'm blessed. My wife and I have been married 42 years. I'm blessed to be able to rely on her for everything that God has called her to do, to stand alongside me in ministry. Arthur's wife's the same way. She's just as called as Arthur is. If she wasn't, Arthur couldn't be successful doing what he does. Mark couldn't either. And I don't know another man that does what we do that could be successful doing what we do without our family understanding and heeding the same calling. I feel like some days our families have to be more called than we are to do what we do because they're the ones that sacrifice the most.
No doubt.
Am I right, Arthur?
You're right. You're right.
No doubt. Last question I'll ask you, Mark, and then this last question. I've often wondered this. George and Glenn, arguably the most popular, the most respected quartet men in the history of music, of Southern gospel music. George said this on stage. He said, Mark Trammell is the best quartet man that he's ever known. When that comes from George Yance, what does Mark Trammell think? What's going through your mind at that point?
Well, the night that he said that, my first reaction was, when we get off this platform, I'm going to whip you. And the reason that was my first thought was at that point, I had been gone from the cathedrals about 4 years, almost 5.
Mm-hmm.
And I was with Gold City by this time. And we were doing the Cathedral Reunion video there in Nashville when he made that statement. And I did say that to him when we got off the platform that night. I said, hey, Pop, and that's what I always called him because he was like a father to me anyway. And I said, hey, Pop, I'm grateful that you made that statement, but why did you make that statement? Sparky, that's the way I feel, son. You're the best quartet man I've ever traveled with. I said, well, he said, does that upset you? I said, well, I'm honored. I had no idea you felt that way. I'm as honored as any award I'll ever get. That honored me, and I'm grateful for that. But now since you've said it out loud where people can hear you, I'm going to have to try to live up to it. And he laughed, barely laughed. He said, "Oh, okay." He said, "Well, you hadn't had no trouble till now, so maybe you'll make it through the rest of your life."
That's hilarious.
And we had the biggest laugh about that. And I've had people ask me what that meant. And I've had the privilege of telling those folks it had nothing to do with singing, if you want to know the truth about it. Because you can find singers.
Yeah.
Singers are a dime a dozen.
Dime a dozen.
Yeah, but people that are willing to yoke up with you and to try to help in whatever way they can fulfill the dreams that the spiritual leadership in whatever group you're in, try to help them fulfill the dreams that God has placed in front of them. At some point in your life, God will send people along to stand alongside you and try to help you fulfill your dreams. Simply because you've been obedient to try to help those men at that season in their lives fulfill the dreams God had placed in their hearts. Yeah. And it has worked exactly like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Arthur, what you got?
Mark, I can't thank you enough for being on the program, man. I know it was the Lord that led you on here. We were trying to figure out who to have next, and you just came to mind, came to my heart, and when I sent you a text and asked you, and I know now why.
Yeah.
It was. I think it was something that somebody needed to hear, something I needed to hear, and
something I needed to hear.
Yeah. I
Thank
can't
the
thank you
Lord.
enough for being obedient and being a part of it. Really do. Love you. I appreciate
It tickles me. I know we've tried a couple of different times and scheduling got in our way, but I'm honored that you'd let me be a part of the podcast.
Oh, we want you to come back soon. We'll get back with you because there's a bunch more we could talk about. I mean, we could talk bus stories alone, and you could fill up the pages of books. I mean, you know.
Well, probably so. Yeah, probably so.
Oh. One quick thing you got to tell me. Then it's the last thing I'm gonna ask you. Okay.
Okay.
Y'all go to the Gaither taping. Jonathan Wilburn tells me the story. You probably know what I'm about to ask. And you walk out and you show Jonathan the cover of that video, and the old fella don't even know the song Gaither asked him to sing. He told us that story, that he learned it in like 5 or 10 minutes, and then he ends up making the cover of the VHS on the Gaither Homecoming series, and he said you were the one that showed him the cover. What was his reaction when you showed him that cover? Do you remember that situation?
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. When Jonathan got to sing at the Gaither thing, here's the story Jonathan told us. He said, we went up there to sing. He said, I'm just a little boy from Carthage, Tennessee. And Bill comes around and asked me if I know the song. And he said, I wasn't going to say no. He said, I really didn't know the song, but I sang it. And he said, I did a pretty good job. I don't recall what the song was. Arthur, I think you remember this story.
He sang the song with Hovey did part of it, and Jonathan did the rest of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Jonathan says the video comes out, and you walked up to him and said, "Look here, you're on the cover." Do you recall that?
I do. And in redneck fashion,
yeah,
Jonathan Wilburn said, "Well, looky there." And he was dumbfounded. He stood there, big old tears come up in his eyes. He said, my. Oh, ignorant boy just barely did get out of high school from Carthage, Tennessee, and I'm on the front cover of a Gaither video.
That's something.
I said, yeah. Just get ready. There's more.
Great story. Great story, and you got thousands of them. Mark, tell everybody where they can find your group and where they can find you online and all that kind of good stuff and everything about your quartet now.
Okay. Mark Trammell Quartet.com. MarkTrammell Quartet.com. That's our website. The Mark Trammell Quartet is our official Facebook page. They can go there and click thumbs up. Follow us every week. Most of our information is going to be on our our weekly information is going to be on our Facebook page, and product information, upcoming projects, cruises, all those kinds of things that we're involved in will be on both the web page and the Facebook page. So they can find out all of our information from either of those two areas.
Man.
Hey, Mark, right quick, I know we didn't touch on this, but tell everybody real quick about the Fall Festival coming up, too, instead of in lieu of the NQC.
Yeah.
Well, as everyone knows by now, the actual NQC, as we've known it all of these 60-some years, because of the social distancing guidelines, and the governor of the state of Tennessee just a few days ago gave us final word on what we could and could not do. And because of the COVID-19 issues and because of the social distancing guidelines, it has moved us into what our Plan B, which was back in April. We began to develop a Plan B and what it would look like, and began to discuss where we could have it, where was going to be the best venue, if we could have it at all. And bottom line, the board came up with this idea that if we don't have convention as we know it, we need to have something not only for the people that miss this music, but for the groups, some way to be able to invest in these groups that have been out of work and they need to work. And it has evolved into the Fall Festival and the last few days of September and the first few days of October, coming up in a couple of weeks now. And I do know that there are still some tickets available. The Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Thursday, I believe, is sold out, and Friday is real close to it. But I do know that there are tickets available still for that week. But it's going to look very different because of the social distancing issues. And since it wasn't going to be the National Quartet Convention with 10,000 people in the building, we literally had to put a different face on it. But it's still going to be the same music that we all enjoy. There'll be a lot more people joining us by way of the online webcast this year, because we can get 17 or 1,800 people in the building. That's it, because of this social distancing issue. But I'll tell you right now, the fine folks in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and the staff at the LeConte Center has gone over and above to make sure that we can actually do this the right way and keep people healthy, keep people safe, and present an opportunity for our groups to get back out there and to do what God's called them to. And that's been our bottom line. And God willing, that's going to take place in 2 weeks.
Mark, we appreciate it, my friend, and we're going to get you back on soon.
Thank you.
All righty.
Hey, bless you. Bless you both. I've enjoyed it.
Appreciate it. Mark Trammell on Southern Gospel News Podcast. We'll be right back with the close of the show.
Here's important new information from the Diabetes Solution Center for you, a family member, or a loved one suffering with diabetes. If you have lost your provider, or if you need a provider for diabetic supplies, you may qualify to receive your diabetic testing supplies now with little or no out-of-pocket cost, regardless of your age. All you need is Medicare or private insurance to be potentially eligible. Call the Diabetes Solution Center right now for details. Just takes a couple of minutes. Our friendly, knowledgeable agents will give you free, no-obligation information, handle all the insurance paperwork, and make sure your supplies are delivered directly to your door for free.
Call U.S. Medical Supply 24 hours a day. 800-590-1164. 800-590-1164. 800-590-1164. Call right now, 800-590-1164.
There was an old-time preacher who had a church on the outskirts of town. You'd never call him a mild-mannered teacher. preacher. He was a shouter right down to the ground. He had a red-letter King James Bible. It opened up to John 3:16. I first heard him at a summer revival. He rolled up his sleeves and he started to sing. He said, "You must confess your sin." He said, "You must be born again." He preached Jesus, crucified and risen from the dead. He said, "You gotta make it right." He said, "You need to come tonight." The Spirit grew stronger with every single passage he read. I got saved when I heard what he said. He said, "Well, I'm a member of that little church now, but the preacher died a long time ago. He was preaching on the street when God called him. Now he's a shouting up in heaven, I know. We're still moving in the right direction, and we're following the way that he led. We got that old-time preacher's conviction, and I still remember just what he said. What he said. Oh, he said, "You must confess your sins." He said, "You must be born again." He preached Jesus, crucified and risen from the dead. Oh, he said, "You gotta make it right." He said, "You need to come tonight." The Spirit grew stronger with every single passage he read. I got saved when I heard what that old-time hellfire brimstone preacher said. I got saved when I heard what he said. He said, "You better listen to what the preacher says."
Arthur, I'm just going to say as we close this thing, the same thing that this is one of them shows that, you know, a lot of times, I'm just going to be frank with folks. A lot of times I watch a clock when we're doing a show because I know when I'm watching the clock, sometimes it's just like you on stage when you're singing with the Kingdom Marriage. You know there's times that people are only going to listen 30, 35 minutes, and y'all need you got to know when to stop. Today we could have went another hour, Arthur.
It was great, man. I don't think anybody be changing any dials on this thing.
No.
It was great.
I mean, when you hear that message, it reminded me of when we talked to Squire. You know what I'm saying? It's just great. You know, I thought about this question that we done went too far. When he's talking about changing NQC and all this, I'll ask you this question. I'll put you on the spot on this question. You know I like to do this anyway.
Oh, good. Thanks.
You know, all you got to do is say yes or no. How about that? I'll give you an easy out. Okay? Yes or no. Okay? COVID-19 happens in 2020. Let's say COVID-19 happened in the year 2000. Okay? Would Martin Cook cancel Singing in the Smokies for COVID-19?
No. Nope.
I don't know what made me think of that.
Hey, the Primitive didn't cancel theirs.
I know. That COVID can't get up in them mountains anyway. You're from up there.
No, that's right. It stays away from here. That's funny.
What would Hamill's reaction to COVID-19 be, you think?
I have no idea. I really don't. It'd be like the rest of them trying to figure out what in the world's going on.
But Martin would have said, we're going to be singing whether you want to or not. Anyway, man, it's been good today. It's been good. We'll be doing this again next week. And for more information on Southern Gospel News Podcast, check out our website, southerngospelnewspodcast.com. If you need something, you got something out of it, we appreciate you listening. Arthur, as always, got one question for you. What's wrong with living right anyway?
Not a thing.
Not a thing. Thanks for joining us once again.
SGNP is excited you chose to listen today. If you'd kindly leave a remark and rating in the podcast remarks section, we surely would appreciate it. Please share with a friend or family member. Look for us on Facebook, Twitter, and our new website, southerngospelnewspodcast.com.
Are you paying too much for term life insurance? There's a tremendous price war among the major term life companies. Rates have dropped dramatically in the past few years. For example, a man age 45 non-tobacco user, $1 million of coverage is only $75 per month, level for the next 10 years. Or a man age 50 non-tobacco user can buy $500,000 of coverage for a monthly premium of only $110, guaranteed not to change for the next 20 years. That's right, level rates for 20 years. And if you're a smoker, we have great rates for you as well. At the Term Lifeline, we specialize in policies of $500,000 and above. So if you're looking for new or replacement term life insurance, call right now for a free quote.
Rates and availability may vary by state. Sample rate quotes are based on preferred non-tobacco underwriting exam required to qualify.
800-803-2142. 800-803-2142. That's 800-803-2142.